Viking religion was deeply interwoven with the everyday lives and cultural practices of the Norse people. Their polytheistic beliefs encompassed a pantheon of gods and goddesses, each associated with different aspects of the natural world, human endeavors, and moral values. Key figures in this pantheon included Odin, Thor, and Freyja, among many others, whose stories and attributes were immortalized in sagas, poems, and ritual practices. Major deities. Odin, often regarded as the All-Father, Odin was the chief of the gods. He was associated with wisdom, war, poetry, and death. Depicted as a one-eyed wanderer who sacrificed his eye for wisdom, Odin was believed to reside in Valhalla, where he received the souls of fallen warriors. He was accompanied by his ravens, Hugin and Munin, who represented thought and memory. Thor, the thunder god Thor, was immensely popular among the Vikings. He wielded the mighty hammer Mjolnir, which was believed to protect both gods and humans from the forces of chaos, especially giants. Thor was associated with storms, thunder, and lightning, and was seen as a protector of humanity. Freyja was a goddess of love, beauty, fertility, and battle. She was also linked to wealth and magic. Freyja had the power to influence matters of the heart and was often invoked in matters of love and fertility. Her chariot was drawn by cats, and she possessed a precious necklace called Brysindamen. Rituals and sacrifices. Vikings practiced a variety of rituals to honor their gods and seek their favor. These rituals often included sacrifices, known as blots, which could be of animals, food, or even humans in some cases. Sacrifices were made to ensure good harvests, success in battle, and protection from harm. One of the most significant ritual sites was the temple at Uppsala in present-day Sweden. This site hosted large gatherings and elaborate ceremonies. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Vikings also held rituals in natural settings such as groves, lakes, and mountains, which they believed were inhabited by spirits. Festivals and celebrations. Festivals played a vital role in Viking religious life. These events were times of communal gathering, feasting, and storytelling. One of the most important festivals was Yule, which marked the winter solstice. Yule was a time to honor the gods, celebrate the return of the sun, and prepare for the coming year. Another significant festival was the Disablat, held in honor of the female spirits known as Desert. This festival was associated with fertility and the well-being of the community. Afterlife beliefs. The Vikings had a rich and complex view of the afterlife. They believed that brave warriors who died in battle were chosen by the Valkyries to reside in Valhalla, Odin's Hall of the Slain. In Valhalla, these warriors would prepare for Ragnarok, the end of the world, where they would fight alongside the gods. Those who did not die in battle might go to Hell, a realm ruled by the goddess Hel. Unlike the Christian concept of hell, this place was not necessarily a place of punishment, but rather a neutral afterlife for those who lived ordinary lives. Mythology and moral values. Viking mythology is filled with tales of gods, giants, and heroes. These stories, known as sagas, were passed down orally through generations before being written down in texts like the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda. These myths served multiple purposes. They explained natural phenomena, provided moral lessons, and reinforced social norms. For instance, the story of Thor's fishing trip, where he battles the world serpent Jormungand, illustrates themes of bravery and the eternal struggle between order and chaos. The myth of Baldur's death, caused by the trickster god Loki, underscores themes of betrayal, loss, and the inevitability of fate. Understanding Viking beliefs. Exploring Viking religion and mythology provides valuable insights into their worldviews and cultural practices. The gods and myths of the Norse people were not just distant, supernatural beings, but integral parts of their daily lives, guiding their actions and shaping their understanding of the world. Through rituals, festivals, and stories, the Vikings maintained a profound connection to their deities and their heritage, ensuring that their beliefs and values were passed down through generations. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring content about the Norse civilization.